The storm rolled in just after dusk, flattening the grass like it owed the wind a debt. Thaddeus Kane had just finished stacking the last of the feed bags in his barn when the thunder cracked open the sky like a warning. He didn't flinch. Storms didn't scare men like him, not after what he'd seen during the blood years in Kansas, not after what he'd buried under these plains. But something else did, something he couldn't name yet. He was halfway to the house when he saw her. At first, he thought it was an animal, curled tight like a fawn beside the porch rail, a dark, shivering bundle pressed into the corner between the steps and the wall. But as the lightning lit the yard, he saw bare feet, toes raw and red from the cold. Then a face, small, angular, streaked with rain and mud. Black hair clung to her cheeks like wet ribbon. A child, no more than 12, and unmistakably Comanche. His hand went to the Colt at his hip, instinct before thought. This was the kind of thing that got men killed out here. A Comanche girl showing up on your land during a storm meant one of two things: bait or warning. Either way, it could end in fire. But she didn't move, didn't beg, didn't cry. Just stared up at him with eyes like riverstone, silent, sharp, and unblinking. He knelt beside her, the storm washing over his hat brim and down his coat collar. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest, as if she could hold herself together by sheer force of will. She looked half dead already, maybe less than half. He could see the bruises on her neck, fresh, a gash across her knee, deep. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and the way she flinched when he reached out told him everything he needed to know. She'd been running, and whoever she was running from hadn't meant to let her live. Thaddeus stood, his boots squelched in the mud. His eyes scanned the horizon, just wind and lightning. No riders, not yet. He looked down at the girl again. He didn't say a word. Just lifted her gently, like you would a busted calf, and carried her through the door of the house he'd built with his own hands. Laid her down on the old horse blanket by the stove. Stoked the fire until it roared like it had something to prove. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He wrapped her in wool, filled a tin cup with broth, and sat beside her without a sound. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one he'd just let into his home. She didn't speak. Not that night. Not the next morning either. Just lay wrapped in the old wool blanket near the stove, eyes half-lidded, watching him like a hawk with a broken wing, too weak to fly, too proud to look away. Thaddeus Kane didn't press her. He knew the look, seen it in the eyes of men who'd crawled away from ambushes, in horses that had been whipped one too many times. Not fear, not exactly. Something older, a silence carved deep enough to bleed. He kept to the edges of the room, moving slow, quiet, like a man working next to a sleeping rattler. He cooked, patched tack, sharpened blades, always keeping her in his periphery. She watched everything, the flick of his wrist while chopping wood, how he fed the fire, where he set his rifle when he thought she wasn't looking. Every detail stored behind those dark, unreadable eyes. By mid-morning, she was sitting up, not speaking, just watching the wind rattle the shutters. Her feet still raw, skin flaking from cold. He set a basin near her with warm water and a bar of lye soap, turned his back so she could clean herself if she wanted. When he turned around, she hadn't moved. The water sat untouched, steam curling into the air like a ghost trying to speak. He crouched beside her again, slow, careful, held out the tin cup with warm broth, the same as last night. She didn't reach for it, so he set it beside her. No words, no questions. Just the smell of onions and bone stock and the slow ticking of the wall clock. She finally moved that afternoon, not to run, not to speak, just to shift closer to the stove and drink half the cup. Her hands trembled, but she didn't spill. Thaddeus watched from across the room, said nothing. When dusk settled over the plains and the coyotes began their long, lonesome songs, she whispered one word. Sachni! It came out broken, like something chipped from stone. She didn't say it again, just stared at the floorboards like they might swallow her whole. Thaddeus nodded once, quiet as ever, walked outside and leaned on the porch post, staring out toward the mesquite hills where the wind moved like something alive. He'd heard that name before, not in English, in Comanche. A word that meant whisper or sometimes shadow. Behind him, inside that cabin, was a girl who carried both. And Thaddeus Kane knew deep in the marrow of his bones that whatever had sent her running was still out there. And it wasn't finished yet. The tracks were easy enough to miss. Just a slight disturbance in the soil near the east fence line, half washed by the night's rain. But Thaddeus Kane had spent most of his life reading land like scripture, and the signs were there, pressed heel prints, shallow toe drags, and one deep gouge where a man had slipped, likely while carrying something heavy or wounded. It wasn't Comanche. These were boot prints, heavy ones, civilized leather, not soft-soled moccasins. He squatted down beside the trail, brushing the mud aside with calloused fingers. There were 4 sets, maybe 5, close together, men tracking in formation, not wandering. He followed the line with his eyes to where the earth grew harder, and the prints vanished into the brush. He didn't like it. Too clean, too fast, too soon. The girl hadn't spoken again. After her name, she'd gone back to watching, back to that stone stillness that made the cabin feel like a church after a funeral. Thaddeus hadn't pushed her, but now, crouched in the mud, with wind in his coat and the scent of wet iron rising from the earth, he was starting to understand just how far she'd run. Back at the house, he kept his boots on when he crossed the threshold. She was sitting on the stool now, one hand resting on the windowsill, staring out over the plain like she was waiting for something or someone to appear on the horizon. He closed the door gently, but she still flinched, just slightly, barely enough to notice. But he saw it. Her spine straightened, shoulders squared, like she was bracing for pain. Thaddeus crouched and opened the small cedar chest near the hearth. From it, he pulled an old cloth bundle and unwrapped it carefully, a pair of soft buffalo hide moccasins, worn but strong. He'd traded for them years ago, from a Tonkawa woman whose boy had died of fever. He placed them on the floor near her feet, without a word. She stared at them, then at him. Her fingers curled against her palms. "Prints near the creek," he said finally, his voice a low scrape in the quiet room. "Boots. 5 men, maybe 6, moving fast. I figure they lost you in the night, but not for long." She looked down, her lip trembling just once before she bit it still. "Whatever they're after," he continued, "they'll come through me first." For the first time, her eyes met his full on. No fear, no mistrust. Just something deeper, something sad. She nodded. Once. Thaddeus nodded back, then turned, grabbed the Winchester off the wall, and checked the chamber. Full. They'd been here, and they'd be back. The name settled in his mind like a splinter. Sani. He didn't know much Comanche. Enough to get by, enough to trade and not get scalped. But that name, it stirred something. Something he'd heard years back in a saloon in Fort Belknap, from a half-drunk ranger with a bullet scar down his jaw. Sahni, daughter of 10 Knives. Not a nickname, a warning. 10 Knives was no ordinary war chief. He was legend wrapped in flesh. A man said to ride with ghosts and vanish into smoke. The kind of story told to greenhorn soldiers around the campfire right before they pissed themselves the first time arrows came singing through the dark. Ruthless, brilliant, untouchable. And according to that ranger, he had a daughter who vanished after a white raid on a winter camp 3 years ago. They said she died in the snow, burned with the rest. But here she was, alive, cold, silent, watching Thaddeus from under a mop of tangled hair, like she'd been to hell and come back fluent in the language. She didn't know he recognized the name, or maybe she did. Maybe that's why she gave it to him in the first place. A test. He didn't ask questions, just poured another ladle of stew into her bowl and set it down with the same steady hands he used to break wild mustangs. Let her chew in peace, slow and careful, like someone not used to meals without strings. Outside, the wind dragged its fingers across the plain, humming against the glass like an omen trying to get in. Thaddeus stepped onto the porch, lit a stub of a cigar, and looked out across the dusk. The land stretched empty and endless, but he felt it in his bones. He wasn't alone out here anymore. Something unseen was moving, maybe already watching. He thought about 10 Knives. If the man believed his daughter was dead, he'd mourned her like a warrior, maybe with blood, maybe with fire. But if he knew she was alive? If word reached him that she'd survived and ended up in the care of a white rancher? Thaddeus drew slow on the cigar, let the smoke curl from his nostrils. Men had been killed for far less. He turned to go back inside, but froze at the sound, just for a second. A single note, high and eerie, carried on the wind. A call. Not owl, not coyote. Human. He waited. Nothing followed. But Sani was already off the stool, eyes wide, staring at the door like it had started breathing. He didn't ask her what she'd heard. He just stepped back inside and quietly bolted the door. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did Thaddeus. He kept the fire low, the lamp lower. The cabin sat in the silence of men preparing for something they couldn't name, but knew was coming. Outside, the prairie wind had gone still, too still, like the land itself was holding its breath. Every few hours, Sani would rise from the blanket and pace the floor with bare feet, her eyes darting to the window, then the door, then back again, searching for a shadow that hadn't yet arrived. Just after midnight, she finally spoke again. Her voice was a rasp, dry, raw. Not Comanche. Thaddeus looked up from the table where he'd been cleaning the Winchester by candlelight. "The men chasing me," she said. "They wear paint, but not Comanche." He didn't speak, just waited. She sat down across from him, fingers clutched tight in her lap. 3 days ago, they came at dusk. 5 riders. Said they were traders. Brought whiskey. Promised peace. My uncle, he didn't trust them. My mother told him to wait. Her eyes drifted somewhere distant. They waited, and died for it. Thaddeus set the Winchester down. They had army coats, she said. Old ones, from the blue soldiers. But under, I saw belt buckles, Texican. One had a necklace made of teeth. Not Comanche teeth, white man's. Another spoke our tongue, but not right, like a schoolboy. Comancheros, Thaddeus muttered. Half-breeds and bounty hounds playing both sides of the war. She nodded. They killed my mother first, then 2 of the young boys. Lit the storehouse, took the horses. They said I was worth more alive. That 10 knives would trade half the South for me. Thaddeus swallowed hard. They tied me up, dragged me behind a mule cart. First night I pretended to be sick. Next night I bit the man who fed me. Third night I ran, hid in the river mud, walked 2 days. Then she looked at him for the first time, and her voice broke. Your house. He stared at her across the flickering shadows. A child, hunted like game, chased across open land, with the ashes of her people still clinging to her skin. And somehow she'd made it to his porch, in the middle of nowhere, while the men who wanted to sell her, like a wolf pelt, rode just behind. He rose slowly, crossed the room, and knelt by the hearth. From the floorboards, he pulled a narrow crate, unlatched it, and opened the lid. Inside, a Sharps rifle, long barrel, custom grip, loaded. He set it gently across the table, looked her square in the eye. Then we'd best be ready. The fog rolled in like spilled milk just before dawn, thick and low, curling through the cottonwoods and creeping across the pasture in slow, silent sheets. Thaddeus Kane stood on the porch, coffee in hand, eyes scanning the shifting mist like it might suddenly grow teeth. Somewhere out there, past the fence line, beyond the reach of the rising sun, were the men who'd burned Sonny's home to the ground. He didn't know how close they were, but he could feel it. The way a man feels the hairs rise on the back of his neck just before a rattler strikes. Inside, Sonny sat by the fire, wrapped in his old duster. She hadn't spoken since the night before, but she didn't need to. Her eyes had gone from scared to sharp, from girl to scout. Every time a floorboard creaked, her hand moved to the hunting knife he'd given her. She hadn't asked for it, just took it with a nod and tucked it into her belt. Thaddeus stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn, boots whispering through the damp grass. He didn't take the straight path, circled around instead, approached slow. He kept the Sharps rifle slung across his shoulder and his revolver loose in its holster. Every shadow looked like a man. Every crow's call made his fingers twitch. When he reached the barn doors, he paused, listened. Nothing but the quiet breath of the land. He slipped inside, scanned the rafters, the stalls, the loft. Empty, at least for now. But the horses were restless, ears twitching, breath sharp. They felt it, too. Then he saw it. A length of twine, cut clean, hanging from the post, where he kept the geldings saddled for emergencies. The knot was fresh, newer than anything else in the barn. Someone had been in here, last night, maybe longer. Thaddeus turned fast, rifle in hand, but no one waited in the doorway. Still, the fog beyond seemed thicker now, closer, watching. He returned to the house without breaking stride, jaw tight, eyes locked ahead. "They've been here," he said as he shut the door behind him. maybe still close. Sani stood, hands clenched. How long? She asked. Hard to say, but they know where you are now. She didn't look surprised, just nodded, then moved to the window and pressed a hand against the cold glass. Will you give me to them? She asked quietly. Thaddeus looked at her, long and level. No, he said, not even if it kills me. She nodded again. No thanks, no tears. Just that same quiet resolve, the kind that's forged in fire and loss. Then she said something he didn't expect. They'll come at night. They like shadows. Thaddeus walked to the gun rack, opened the drawer, and began laying out rounds like a priest setting communion. Then we'll make the dark hours, he said. And outside, the fog thickened like breath on a dying man's lips. They found the body just after sundown. Thaddeus Kane was walking the edge of his north pasture, checking fence posts for any fresh breaks, part of him hoping foolishly that the stillness in the air meant the danger had passed. The vultures told him otherwise. 5 of them, circling low and lazy above a patch of scrubland near the dry arroyo, wings catching the last gold light of evening. He didn't rush, just unslung the sharps from his back and moved in slow, steady steps. When he crested the rise, the smell hit first: blood, rot, and something worse: panic left too long in the sun. The man was face down in the dirt, arms stretched wide like someone had tried to fly before dying. His coat was torn open at the back, shirt soaked through with blood. The scalp was gone, clean cut, taken with precision, but it wasn't Comanche work. Thaddeus crouched, brushing dirt from the boot heel. Standard military issue. The man wore cavalry spurs, but the stitching on his coat was newer than regulation. His hands were calloused in the wrong places, more saddle than sword. Whoever he wasn't regular army, just dressed to look the part. He rolled the body with care. The man's eyes stared skyward, wide and glassy. His mouth was open like he'd died mid-scream, but the throat was slashed so deep Thaddeus could see spine. It wasn't the scalping that did it. It was the fear carved into his face. Whoever killed him wanted it known. Pinned to the corpse's chest was a single feather, black-tipped, red-streaked. A warning sign from deep Comanche country, but not their usual mark. More theatrical, more personal. Back at the cabin, Sani was already at the window when Thaddeus returned. She looked past him toward the smoke trail on the northern horizon, where Thaddeus had just buried the stranger. You found one, she said. Found what was left. She didn't ask how he died, just turned back to the hearth. It wasn't my father, she said after a moment. He wouldn't leave a message, not like that. He sends silence. Thaddeus nodded. He agreed. Someone's trying to stir things up, he muttered, unbuckling his gun belt and laying it across the table. Make it look like a Comanche war party's already on the move. Get the nearby settlements to panic. Maybe ride out before they ask questions. Or kill us before my father can find me, Sakni said quietly. Thaddeus looked at her. Not a child anymore. Not really. Just a survivor too young to wear that kind of truth. He reached for the lamp, trimmed the flame low. They're sending a message, he said. We just need to send one back. Outside, the wind picked up again, dry and sharp as flint, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled, not at the moon, but at whatever walked the land beneath it. The smoke rose in a thin, steady line from the ridge west of Kane's land, too narrow for a campfire, too deliberate for a brush burn. Thaddeus spotted it before dawn, standing on the porch with his coffee gone cold and the sharps cradled in one arm. It wasn't the smoke that chilled him. It was the shape, tall, straight, like a spear thrust into the morning sky. A Comanche signal fire. Not war, not yet, but close. Inside, Sani had already seen it. She stood barefoot at the window, face lit orange by the fire's reflection, lips pressed tight together. She didn't ask what it meant. She already knew. "They found me," she said simply. Thaddeus set the rifle down and watched the smoke rise higher. "Could be scouts," he said. "Could be your father." She shook her head. "Not him. Not yet. My father doesn't send smoke. He sends eyes." She walked to the door, opened it slowly, and stepped onto the porch, letting the wind sweep her tangled hair behind her. Her bare feet made no sound on the wood. Thaddeus followed, silent beside her. The two of them watched the sky burn slowly, with the promise of something coming. Whether it was justice or vengeance, neither of them knew yet. "I think they want to see what kind of man took me in," Sani said. Thaddeus didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the ridgeline. "They'll find a man who's tired of running," he said finally. "Tired of hiding. And real damn tired of people dying for other men's profits." Sani looked up at him, not with awe, not with gratitude, but with something quieter. Respect. She pointed toward the smoke. "Those aren't war signals," she said. "They're watchers, sent to see if I'm still alive, or traded." Thaddeus felt the weight of that hang in the air. "You think your father sent them?" She hesitated, then nodded. "If I'm alive, he comes. If I'm dead, he burns everything." Thaddeus rubbed a hand down his jaw, the stubble rasping against his palm. "Then we better keep you breathing." That afternoon, he rode out to the edge of his northern fence line, slowly, visibly, no weapons drawn. Just a man checking posts, letting whoever watched know that he wasn't afraid, but wasn't looking for a fight either. He saw nothing, but he felt it, eyes on him, somewhere in the hills, tracking every hoofbeat, every breath. By nightfall, the smoke was gone. But the silence it left behind was louder than any shot Thaddeus had ever heard. And in that silence, he knew the fire wasn't over. It was just waiting for wind. He came without a sound. Thaddeus Kane didn't hear hooves, didn't hear boots on soil, or breath on wind. One moment, the pasture was empty. The next, a figure stood at the edge of the cottonwoods, half shrouded in dusk and dust, as still as stone. An old man. He wore a buffalo hide cloak, streaked with white ash and ochre, his hair long and gray, braided with strips of rawhide and what looked like crow feathers. His face was carved with lines so deep they looked like they'd been etched by knives, not time. No war paint, no weapons, just the heavy weight of presence. Sani stepped outside before Thaddeus could speak. She stood at the top of the steps, eyes wide, lips parted like she was seeing a ghost. "Chasi," she whispered. The old man didn't move, not a nod, not a word. But the way his eyes softened, the barest flicker, told Thaddeus everything. This was family. Her mother's father. The ghost who walks. Thaddeus stepped down from the porch slowly, hands away from his gun belt. He didn't speak, didn't offer welcome, just stood there, letting the man see him, judge him. That was what this was. Not a visit, a reckoning. Chasey stepped forward, not quickly, not threatening, like the land itself had decided to take on human shape and move at last. His eyes never left Thaddeus. When he stopped 10 feet away, he finally spoke, his voice soft and low, like wind brushing across an open grave. "You gave her water." Thaddeus nodded. "Yes." "You gave her fire." Another nod. "Yes." "You kept her alive." "She did most of that herself," Thaddeus said. "I just opened the door." Chasey turned his gaze to Sahni. The hard lines in his face cracked for a moment, and a tremble passed through his shoulders. She stepped off the porch, crossed the space between them like a drifting leaf, and fell into his arms without a word. He held her. No cries, no sobbing. Just two still figures, in the dying light, bone and blood, remembering what the world tried to take from them. After a moment, Chasey looked back at Thaddeus. 10 knives rides, he said. When? By moon's third rise. That gave them 2 days. Thaddeus didn't ask if the chief was coming with peace or fire. He already knew the truth. That decision hadn't been made yet, but it would be, based on what Chasey saw here, whether this white rancher was friend or captor. Chasey reached into his cloak and pulled out a small bundle of sage, lit it with a flint striker, and let the smoke coil between them. A ritual, a witness. He set it at Thaddeus's feet. "You will not lie while this burns." "I haven't lied yet," Thaddeus said. Chasey stared into him, like he could peel away skin and see the soul beneath. Then he said nothing more. Just sat in the dirt, cross-legged, facing the house, and began to wait. The second moonrise came with no wind. No coyotes howled, no owls called. Even the insects seemed to fall silent, as if the whole land had pressed its ear to the ground and heard something coming. Thaddeus Kane stood at the edge of his porch, eyes on the horizon, heart ticking slow but steady, like a man waiting for the hammer to fall. Behind him, the cabin was still. Sani slept on the floor by the fire, wrapped in her mother's old robe, gifted by Chasey just before dusk. She hadn't asked what it meant. She knew. It was mourning cloth, for her mother, for the boy cousins shot in the dark, for the village that no longer breathed. And maybe, if things went wrong, for Thaddeus too. Chasey hadn't spoken since the day before. He sat at the edge of the pasture, unmoving, hands folded in his lap like he was carved from stone, watching, waiting, listening to signs only he could hear. Then, just after midnight, he stood. Thaddeus saw it in the way the old man turned his head, just slightly, toward the east. "They come," Chasey said. He didn't shout. He didn't raise alarm. He just said the words, like someone reading a sentence that had been written years ago. Thaddeus followed his gaze. Far across the dark hills, a flicker, then another, then many, campfires, small, controlled, moving in lines. 50 riders, maybe more, coming slow, not charging, not hiding, but coming. Thaddeus stepped down from the porch and crossed to Chasey's side. "Is it him?" The old man nodded once. 10 knives, my blood. Thaddeus felt the weight of it settle deep in his chest. Is he coming for peace? Chasey's eyes didn't leave the distant lights. He is coming for truth. And in the Comanche world, truth came with blades. Inside the cabin, Sani stirred, then rose. Her eyes were clear. No fear, just resolve. She stepped outside, stood between the two men, and looked out at the approaching storm of her people. She whispered, "Will he know me?" Chasey didn't answer right away. Then he said, "If he sees you whole, not broken, he will know." Thaddeus watched the fire lines grow closer, the space between each rider deliberate, disciplined, not raiders, not renegades. This was something else entirely. A council on horseback. A judgment. He glanced at his rifle, thought better of it. "I won't run," he said. Chasey didn't blink. "Then stand tall." And so they waited. 3 figures on the edge of the plains. An old warrior, a grieving girl, and a rancher who had opened his door to the wrong child at the wrong time, or maybe the right one. By sunrise, 10 knives would ride into their lives, and the world would decide what kind of man Thaddeus Kane really was. The sun cracked the horizon in a line of fire, bleeding orange across the grasslands, turning dew into steam, and casting long shadows that looked too much like riders. Thaddeus Kane stood in the yard with his sleeves rolled, boots caked in dust, arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't slept, not even closed his eyes. Sani stood beside him now, her shoulders squared, her robe cinched tight with a strip of braided hide. She looked like the last surviving ember from a fire too stubborn to die. Chasey remained seated in the same place he'd occupied all night, legs folded, back straight, his eyes open but unreadable. He hadn't said another word. He didn't need to. The earth told them all what was coming. And then, without fanfare, without warning, they arrived. Not over the ridge like a cavalry charge, not screaming down from the hills. They came quietly, like wind before a storm. One by one, horsemen emerged from the scrub brush, moving in unison, their ponies stepping soft but sure. Faces painted in solemn hues, red, black, ash gray. War colors, but not wild. Controlled, focused. There were at least 50, maybe more. At their center rode a man who made the others look like shadows. Broad-shouldered, wrapped in a robe of white elk hide, his long hair tied with copper wire and bone. His eyes, even at a distance, carried weight, dark, unflinching, heavy with the knowledge of every death he'd caused and every life he'd spared. 10 knives! He did not shout, did not gesture. He simply raised one hand, and the entire procession stopped 20 paces from the porch. Then silence. Thaddeus could feel Sani trembling beside him, not from fear, but something heavier. Grief, memory, longing. She stepped forward, just one step, her voice steady despite the crack in it. "Father!" 10 knives dismounted with fluid grace, like he'd never known weakness. His eyes locked on hers. They stayed there, unmoving, 2 statues shaped by sorrow. "You live," he said in Comanche. "I ran," she answered. He looked past her to Thaddeus. His eyes narrowed, not with rage, but calculation. This was a man who'd weighed men's lives before, who had decided who died and who lived with nothing more than a glance. "He took you?" 10 knives asked. Sani shook her head. "He gave me warmth, Food, fire, nothing more. Chasey rose now, slowly, his voice like gravel turned soft by rain. He gave her water. 10 Knives didn't respond. He stepped forward slowly until he stood toe to toe with Thaddeus. The chief stared into him, deep, like a man peeling bark off a tree to see what kind of rot might live beneath. Thaddeus didn't blink. She came to me nearly frozen. I let her in, he said quietly. Didn't ask for it, didn't plan for it, but I'll be damned if I'd send her back into the dark. 10 Knives said nothing, just stared. Then, after a long, dangerous silence, he spoke in English. Many white men take, few protect. He looked down at Sani, then back to Thaddeus. You stand, you do not run. I won't, Thaddeus said. 10 Knives nodded once. Then the judgment passed. Then we speak, not with fire, but with truth. And the army that could have burned his world to ash dismounted. They came down from their horses in silence. No war cries, no painted faces twisted in rage, just solemn footsteps pressing into the earth like they belonged to it. Each man moved with the discipline of soldiers, not raiders. Their weapons stayed strapped to their backs, their eyes alert but not hostile. This wasn't vengeance. It was something older, a reckoning. Thaddeus Kane watched them fan out in a wide arc around the homestead, their formation deliberate, protective, not predatory. These weren't men looking for blood. They were building a circle, a sacred space. 10 Knives said nothing as he stepped inside the ark. Sani stood beside Thaddeus, still and unblinking. She hadn't flinched once, not even when her father approached within arm's reach. Her robe fluttered slightly in the breeze, the fringe catching in the morning light. The old chief turned to Chasey and spoke a phrase in Comanche. The elder nodded, then gestured toward the porch. 10 Knives faced Thaddeus again. You have my daughter, he said. Now you will tell me how. Thaddeus took a slow breath. There was no good way to dress it up, so he didn't bother. She was half dead under my porch, he said. Storm blowing sideways, feet cut open, dress torn. Looked like someone tried to make her a ghost and left her short of dead. 10 Knives didn't move, but Thaddeus felt the temperature in the air change. Sani stared at her father, waiting. She didn't beg, Thaddeus continued, didn't cry, just sat there watching. And I reckon I saw something in her I'd only seen once before, during the war, a child who'd lost too much too fast and was still too proud to fall over. 10 Knives remained expressionless. She told me bounty men came in traders' coats, said they took your village apart piece by piece, then tried to sell her back to you like cattle. At that, something flickered behind the chief's eyes, a twitch of muscle in his jaw. Not rage, not yet, but the root of it. She ran, Thaddeus said. They hunted. I helped. The silence that followed was thicker than the air. Then 10 Knives turned to Sani. They did not harm you? Not him, she said. He stepped forward, raised a hand to her cheek, and let it rest there for a heartbeat. Then another. When he dropped it, he turned to the men around him and barked a single word. They sat, every one of them, a ring of warriors, seated in solemn unity around the cabin. Thaddeus didn't know the word, but he knew what it meant. This was not war. This was counsel. 10 Knives looked to Chasey. He speaks truth? Chasey nodded once. He does. The chief turned back to Thaddeus. Then we will not raise fire today. A pause. But the ones who wear blue coats and speak lies, those men will feel it. Thaddeus met his eyes. Then let me help you light the match. 10 Knives said nothing. He just studied Thaddeus Kane for a long, measured moment, his gaze not of a father, nor even a chief, but of something older, a man who'd spent his life judging whether strangers would live or die. Thaddeus stood still under the weight of it, letting the silence stretch between them like a drawn bow. Finally, the chief spoke, not to Thaddeus, but to the circle of warriors. He does not lie, and he did not take what was not his. A few heads nodded. Others watched without expression. Every man here had buried kin, seen fires rise from village grounds, and yet none of them had drawn steel, not yet. 10 Knives stepped forward and removed something from the folds of his robe. A wrapped bundle, long and narrow. He held it out toward Sani. She took it with both hands and began unwrapping the doe's skin slowly. Inside was her mother's burial robe, stained with ash, laced with black beadwork, the fabric worn smooth by grief. Sani stared at it, and her shoulders trembled, but she didn't cry. Not now, not here. She simply stepped forward and placed the robe gently across Thaddeus's arms. The circle stirred. Gasps, murmurs in Comanche. Even Chasey blinked in surprise. Thaddeus looked down at the cloth. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Sani's voice was soft but steady. "My father offers you a gift given only once in a bloodline, the last robe of my mother. It is how we remember those who sheltered us from storms." 10 Knives turned toward the circle, raising his voice just enough to carry. This man did what the white soldiers would not. He took no price, asked for no ransom. He gave warmth. He gave bread. He gave safety to the daughter of his enemy. He looked at Thaddeus again. "I cannot give you back what your people fear us for, but I can give you this." Thaddeus swallowed hard. He wasn't a man built for ceremony. Never had been. But this meant something. It meant everything. He nodded once, then folded the robe carefully and held it to his chest. "Thank you," he said, "but I didn't do it for this." "I know," 10 Knives replied. And that, more than the gift itself, sealed the bond. As the sun climbed higher, warriors began building a fire, not for war, but for food. Women emerged from the trees. He hadn't even known they were there, carrying satchels and cloth-wrapped bundles. A council feast, he realized. Not for celebration, for recognition. The girl who should have died hadn't. The man who should have turned her away hadn't. And somehow, without meaning to, Thaddeus Kane had stepped into something larger than himself, something older than borders, deeper than treaties. He had become, in their eyes, not just an ally, but a story worth telling. The fire cracked softly in the center of the circle, its light catching on painted faces and the dull gleam of worn weapons laid respectfully on the grass. No one spoke loudly. Words here were careful things, measured, earned, sacred. Thaddeus Kane sat cross-legged beside Chasey, the robe of Sani's mother still folded across his knees, unsure if he was a guest or a trial that hadn't ended yet. 10 knives hadn't sat. He stood by the fire like a mountain carved out of war and time, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on a small leather pouch hanging from his horse's saddle. It hadn't moved all day, hadn't swung, hadn't shifted. But Thaddeus had the feeling that whatever was inside it weighed more than a man could carry. Sani sat near the edge of the circle, speaking quietly with a woman who looked old enough to be her grandmother. The woman was plaiting Sani's hair, whispering words too soft to hear. Sani listened, eyes on the fire, hands folded neatly in her lap. The girl who had arrived at his doorstep, near dead, was gone. What remained was someone new, someone older, sharper. Finally, 10 knives turned and walked toward the saddlebag. He opened the pouch and removed a small object wrapped in red cloth. When he returned to the fire, he unwrapped it with care. It was a silver army badge, U.S. Cavalry, blood-stained, burned at the edges. He held it up between 2 fingers. "This," he said, his voice low and clear, "was found near my wife's body. The man who wore it had painted his face like a Lipan, but his hands carried a soldier's scars, and his teeth, 10 knives trailed off. His teeth were too clean." Murmurs moved through the circle. Chasey's jaw tightened. Sani didn't look away. "The men who came to our camp wore lies," 10 knives said. "Blue coats traded for wolf skins, English tongues trying to mimic our words. They wanted to start war, not with courage, with masks." He dropped the badge into the fire. It hissed, sparked, then blackened. "They wanted me to burn, to lead my warriors against settlers, ranchers, children, so they could point and say, 'See, the Comanche cannot be trusted,' so they could wipe us clean." Thaddeus spoke before he thought better of it. "And Sani was the proof you wouldn't." 10 knives turned slowly. "Yes?" Thaddeus nodded. "So, they hunted her, not just to sell her back to you, but to kill the one thing that made you hesitate." The chief didn't answer. He didn't need to. Around the fire, every warrior understood. Every one of them had lost someone to whispers disguised as orders, to rifles masked by treaties. Thaddeus looked into the fire. And now, 10 knives stared into the flames. "Now we speak with more than words." The war hadn't started yet, but the reckoning had. The dawn came with no birdsong, just wind, low and steady, rippling across the grass like something too quiet to be trusted. The fire from the night before had burned down to coals, now gray and smoldering. Warriors packed their gear in silence, tightening saddle straps, checking blades. A hush hung over the camp, not fear, not weariness. Focus. 10 knives stood at the center of it all, still as stone. He hadn't slept. Neither had Thaddeus Kane. They'd spent the last hour speaking in low voices, just beyond the porch, far from the ears of warriors and kin. Thaddeus had laid it out plain, what he knew, what Sani had told him, and what he suspected. That these weren't just raiders, that they weren't just killers. They were pawns in something bigger, soldiers in disguise, guns for hire. "Comancheros don't move this bold without someone behind them," Thaddeus had said. "Somebody's paying for scalps to stir up a war." 10 knives hadn't disagreed, just listened, his eyes fixed on the horizon like he could already see the road that led to the truth. When Thaddeus finished, the chief had said one thing: "They want smoke. Let them choke on it." Now the warriors mounted up. Sani stood beside her father, head held high. He reached into his pouch and handed her a carved bone pendant, her mother's. She closed her hand around it without a word, then turned to Thaddeus. "You'll stay here?" she asked. "For now," he said. "Too many eyes watching. If I ride with you, it changes the story." 10 Knives nodded. "You're marked now," he said. "They will come for you." Thaddeus glanced toward the tree line. "Let 'em try." Then came the thunder, not of hooves, but of wheels. From the east, a dust cloud rose beyond the creek, too smooth to be random. Then the glint of metal, 3 wagons flanked by riders. Civilian dress, but the formation was military, professional, the kind of men who wore law as a mask and carried death under their coats. Thaddeus stepped down from the porch, jaw clenched. "You expecting company?" he asked. 10 Knives said nothing, just watched the approaching convoy. Sani's eyes narrowed. "That's them," she whispered. "The ones who came to our village. I remember the man on the left. He wore that same red bandana." Chassis emerged from the brush with his bow already strung. He didn't speak either. Then came the shout. From the lad wagon, a voice called out in broken Comanche, "We seek parley. Come forward unarmed." A lie. Even from here, Thaddeus could see the rifle barrels tucked beneath wagon canvas, could feel the way their horses shifted, impatient, too rehearsed. 10 Knives mounted his horse. So did his men. "Do we meet them?" Thaddeus asked. The chief shook his head. "Number we show them." "Show them what?" 10 Knives looked at him then, eyes like obsidian, sharp with clarity. "That they have already lost." And with a single whistle, he sent his warriors into formation, not to attack, but to surround. They didn't fire the first shot. They didn't need to. When the riders crested the last hill and saw themselves outflanked, 50 Comanche warriors emerging from the grass in absolute silence. No battle cries, no chaos, just precision and purpose. Their bravado cracked like sun-baked earth. You could feel it. Men who thought they held all the cards suddenly realized they were sitting at the wrong table, in the wrong game, with their hands wide open. The lad wagon rolled to a halt. The man with the red bandana, the one Sani had pointed out, climbed down with fake ease, spitting tobacco into the dirt like he had something to prove. He wore a sidearm low and heavy, too polished to be for work. His smile came slow, like a blade half drawn. "This is private land," Thaddeus Kane said, stepping forward before the man could speak. "Unless you've come to confess to burning a village and murdering women, I'd suggest you turn those wheels around." The man didn't flinch, didn't blink. "You're harboring a fugitive," he said. "An Indian girl. There's a bounty." "She has a name," Thaddeus snapped, "and you're about to find out how many men are willing to die over it." 10 Knives appeared beside him, mounted, towering, wrapped in white elk hide like a war ghost made flesh. His warriors fanned out behind him in perfect silence, eyes cold, bows strung, rifles leveled. The man in the red bandana took a step back. "You think you can scare the law with feathers and paint?" he sneered. "You're nothing but—" He didn't finish the sentence because Sani stepped forward. and behind her, Chasey raised something high into the air, a folded piece of paper, creased and blood-stained. A letter, Colonel's seal still pressed into the wax. Sani spoke, her voice strong. This letter was given to my uncle before he died. It names the men who ordered the attack, names the traitors, the bribes, the false trail meant to lead to war. She tossed it at the man's feet. "You're in it." He paled. Just a flash, a single blink of fear. 10 Knives spoke then, his voice cold enough to strip bark. "You rode here for coin. You will leave in shame." The man reached for his weapon, too slow. One arrow, only one, whistled from the ridge and buried itself in the dirt an inch from his boot. Another landed in the wheel of the wagon, cracking the spoke clean in half. That was the message. We choose not to kill you, not today, not unless you make us. Thaddeus leaned in close, voice low enough that only the man could hear. "Next time you come for her, bring a coffin. Yours." The man backed off, mounted, turned without another word. The wagons wheeled around, and they left. By nightfall, they were dust. And in the hush that followed, Sani turned to her father. "What now?" 10 Knives looked at Thaddeus. "We rebuild, together." And for the first time in days, Thaddeus Kane smiled. Not because the danger had passed, but because the line had been drawn. And this time, it had been drawn in truth.